All right. So we are on time period 3. Can someone tell me what the dates are for time period 3?
1715 to 1900.
17 what?
50.
Yeah. Okay. I thought you said 15 there for a second. 1750. Thank you, Lexi. 1750 to 1900. And we're going to start with the Unit 5, which starts on page 98 of your study guides. The Enlightenment, which is something we certainly talked about at school. The Enlightenment is the culmination of what I call the four cousins, four intellectual movements in Europe that transformed the society in period 1 to pretty crappy to dominant power in time period 3. It takes place mostly in the 18th century, so it extrapolates, it crosses time periods 2 to time period 3. We know that the Enlightenment is a social science revolution. We're not talking about biology or physics, but we're looking at things like political science, religion, philosophy, sociology. We're basically taking the principles of the scientific revolution, which isn't even mentioned in these documents, things like experimentation, hypotheses testing, looking for answers for things we've always just kind of assumed. We're going to take those concepts from the laboratory, from an experimental setting, and apply them to wider phenomena in society. So what is the best form of government? Well, there's only really one way to know that, and that is to test multiple forms. Clearly, those in power, especially dictators, absolute monarchs who have been around in family form for centuries, are not terribly interested in allowing people to test. So at some point, if we cannot test these theories with the permission of those in charge, what is going to be our next course of action?
To revolt.
Yeah, we're going to see lots of revolutions in this time period. And if you remember, if you have your class notes, we always talked about at the beginning of every time period, what are the big themes of this time period? And definitely one of the big themes of time period 3 is political revolution. We see it in France, of course. We see it in the United States. We see it in Haiti. We see it in Latin America. And most of those revolutions will be successful in that they change the government and lead to new forms of leadership. So that is definitely part of that. The key word when I think of the Enlightenment is reason. Why do we do what we do? How do we know this is something that's appropriate for people as a whole? We're just trying to think about it. Now, that doesn't mean that every revolution that takes place is a rational, reasonable process. We know that's not true. There's going to be violence and death and all those things. But the theory behind the revolution is to create a reasonable, rational society. So we will see across time period 3 the increase in the concept of citizen participation. I still would not use the democracy word in the 19th century because women can't vote anywhere really to a great extent. There's the vast majority of male citizens also cannot vote. By the end of the time period, we've improved that, but we still are nowhere near a 50% voting process by the end of the 19th century, by the end of period 3. So we're moving towards that. But until you grant women the right to vote, how can you talk about democracy? How can you talk about the people, which would include most of us, participating actively in their government? So I would be careful when writing about this to use the D word, as I've said many times. Don't really think democracy is appropriate. If you say it, it's fine. It's not going to be a big deal. It's like you say England when you should have said Great Britain. At the end of the day, it's not a huge deal. But it's one of those things that just be careful about that concept. Slavery is still prominent until, about 2/3 of the way through this time period. In places like Brazil, it exists until 1888. So we have a lot of things that are not terribly democratic in spite of major improvements in participation during this time period. As you may remember, my favorite stat from this time period is that in the first American presidential election, 1789, 4% of Americans can vote. 4. One hand. So that shows you that there is not as much participation as sometimes we look back and go, the founding fathers descended from heaven and gave out. No, they did not. They did not. They were humans. They were flawed. They were slave owners, the vast majority of them, as you know. So there was a lot of flaws in the system. Again, the hypocrisy of writing that all men are created equal and looking outside your own window and seeing humans enslaved. Okay, so the Enlightenment is great progress. But as I know you progress is not always a straight line. Progress is not always an up curve. Its progress is something that takes time and takes effort and takes consistency. And if you get lazy on it, progress will go backwards and you will lose what you have gained. And we certainly see that in numerous contexts, including the situation we're looking at now as we start to reopen some things. We got to be careful about doing it correctly, even though all of us would love to go have dinner tomorrow at a restaurant and sit around a table and eat. That would be awesome. and see people we love and care about that we haven't been able to do that. But if we do it too quickly, and I'm not the person who knows what that answer is, how quickly is too quickly, that's not me, but we know we got to be careful. So whatever that means, we'll see. But at least we're seeing some progress in that area, which I think is positive for all of us. It questions traditions. We're going to challenge assumptions that, the church always says that, in many states, religion and government are tied together, along with the nobility. Usually in societies at this point, you have those three factors: king or queen, the nobles, the rich, powerful, old families who've been around for a long time, and the leading religious organization, whether that be a church, a mosque, or whatever. You see those ideas tied together because all three of those people have influence, all three of those people have power, and most of the time, if we have access to power, we want to maintain it. We want to keep it because we like the privileges that power gives us, and that's true for almost every single one of us. We also see the introduction of the term nationalism. Huge concept during this time period. Anybody want to take a stab, as you wake up still, many of you, to what nationalism means? Well, what does that term imply?
Isn't it pride for your country and hate for others?
I think that's partially true. Pride it's stronger than that. The hate for others is absolutely part of it. Pride in your country is just good old fashioned patriotism. I think the vast majority of us, it's July 4th, we're going to wear our American flag stuff and hey, red, white, and blue, that kind of stuff. Because we are generally, most people have pride in where they're from, have pride in their background, their family, the 502 rep and that, all that good stuff. That's part of most of our backgrounds. But it's more than that. And I think you address that with the hatred for others. It's the feeling that you are so dominant that you should express that dominance through conquest. Now, we know that conquest is a huge part of human history, but the empire, by definition, is a multinational state. We've got numerous different cultures involved in there. Some of the great empires of the past wanted to bring people to absorb them into their culture. Some wanted to keep those people separated and just basically suck out resources from them. But a nationality is the notion of we are French, we are Chinese, we are American, we are whatever we are. And there is pride in that. And there are certain definitions of that. I am Chinese because I speak this language. I was born in this place. I have these cultural values. I eat this food, all those different kind of ideas. So nationalism helps bring people together. And I think part of that, there's numerous factors to that. We're going to see the improvements in communication through the Industrial Revolution. We're going to see the improvements in transportation so people can actually travel to places. You may remember from time period 1, my favorite statistic of the medieval era is that the vast majority of people never move more than 10 miles from their home their entire life. Well, that is now something that's possible in time period 3, and not just for the rich. Train rides are going to be pretty cheap by 1900. Public transportation exists in major cities all over the industrialized world. So a person who doesn't have a whole lot of money may ride a subway or a bus across town every day, 20 miles to go to work. And that's something that their ancestors would have never thought possible. So we are seeing more of our culture. We're seeing more of our people. We also have the introduction of public schools, where in many cultures where we are taught history, which is usually yay us, everybody else is crap. I mean, most of us don't grow up hating anything. Kids, and you all know this from your own experience, if you have little siblings or cousins or you babysit at a time, you know that the vast majority of little kids are sweet, they are innocent, they are trusting, they are loving. Hate is something for most of us that is taught by others. And so school is one platform for that. Everybody else sucks. Ugh. And so 20 years later, when it's time to go to war, heck yeah, I'll fight the Germans. I already hate them anyway, that kind of thing. So that's something that is created through society. And then we also, of course, have the concept of exclusion. Nationalism can be a very, very powerful force. We're going to bond together to fight. Those of you that have been on teams or, been in a play or done something, played music with other people, there is a great bond of coming together for a common purpose. It's something I think most humans crave, and right now we're lacking that in many ways, and that's something many of us miss, is that working together with other people for a common purpose, for moving forward to do something together is very powerful. Well, nationalism also excludes. We start to say, this is what an American looks like, or a French person looks like, or a South African looks like. Well, you were born here, but you speak a different language. Your family doesn't eat what my family eats. I'm not really sure how loyal you are. And we will see the nasty side of nationalism, for example, in the rise of what's called anti-Semitism, where we start to discriminate against Jewish people in Europe more and more and more, after we had the Enlightenment, which said we should be tolerant. And we have a short period where we start to be more accepting of people's different beliefs and backgrounds. And then nationalism comes along a couple decades later and says, you know what? I don't know. They don't eat sausages, so they can't be a real German. And that seems petty, and it is. But that was part of the identity that I belong to this group, and I'm important in my life that I identify with these people. But gosh, those folks, I don't know if they belong. And so we're going to see the exclusion of people as well. So nationalism is both a positive unifying force, and it can also definitely be a negative force as it excludes people and tells them they don't belong. We also see the expansion of some rights. I mentioned that we will abolish slavery in most civilized nations by the end of time period 3, even though it's a slow process. We see the ending of feudalism around the world. Russia, for example, ends serfdom in this time period. We see more rights expanded, although not completely. Again, women are mostly left out. But we pass laws in industrial countries that say you can't have children 8-year-old working in a factory. Now, to us, that seems like, why would you pass a law to do that? Because in our society, it's just accepted you shouldn't have 8-year-olds working in factories. Well, that progress had to happen. So the Enlightenment is about rationality. It's about progress. Slow, according to our modern sensibilities. No one in this Zoom would love to get in a time machine and go live in 1850. Even in the most progressive society in the world, which is probably Great Britain, it would still be way less rights and opportunities that you have right now. So just understand that process. So if for some reason you were writing about the progression of human rights, of participation in society, your post context would be very, very easy in that we allow women to vote in the 20th century. We expand rights for ethnic and religious minorities in the 20th century. We allow people to participate in ways that they would have never done so before. We still have a ways to go, but my grandmother died 20 years ago. And if she could come back now and see the progress, and she'd be shocked about some of those options that are there. So it's even in my lifetime, I've seen major changes, and that will continue to be the case, I imagine, as we become more accepting of people's rights and abilities to make their own choices in the coming years. At least I certainly hope that is the case. And it talks about the demand for women's suffrage. Notice it says demands. It doesn't say they get it. There are only a couple societies here and there, mostly in Scandinavia, places like Norway, that let women vote. Again, in most societies in 1900, all men can't vote either. Usually voting is tied to what concept for a man? What allows you to be able to vote in most?
Land.
Yep, how much you own, correct, your wealth. So that is absolutely true. So even poor men are generally not allowed to vote in most societies at this point. Okay, any questions on the Enlightenment? I kind of went on a little bit of a ramble there, but that tends to happen. But the Enlightenment is one of the most important concepts, I think, in forming what we would call modern society. Okay, anything? We good? All right, next page, 5.2. So this is our revolutionary time period. We already talked about nationalism and commonalities on page 100. We see new nation states. A lot of empires will break up. There is a desire to be with people like us, with values like us, to not have foreigners control us, to not have people with different values tell us what to do. That is a huge part of it. And also it is just discontent with monarchy. Discontent with having to do all the things with no choices. That's just something that people start to rebel against. And once we see successful rebellion, it's definitely going to spread. Of our revolutions, chronologically, do you remember which major revolution was first?
Was it the French Revolution?
No, it is not, mademoiselle.
American.
Yes, the American is first, followed by the French. Not that you need to remember this, but you may remember that there was a big prison in Paris called the Bastille. It had not been used as a prison. They basically put mentally challenged people in there with various mental illnesses they didn't understand and didn't know how to treat. That palace is attacked, or that fort is attacked basically because it holds lots of gunpowder and it arms the French people in their fight against their government. And then that fort is torn down. And then whenever France starts to send out ambassadors, people to go visit other countries and talk about their relationships, when they come to the United States, they give President Washington the key to the Bastille as a thank you, because they feel like America's revolution inspired the French Revolution. And today you can see the key to the former Bastille prison in George Washington's house in Mount Vernon, just outside of Washington, D.C. So that is an example of showing you that America was first and it inspired others. And then, of course, the French will inspire lots of other people as well, and in various other revolutions. When you start seeing the revolts in Latin America, once one starts against the Spanish, there's strength in numbers. if you have multiple siblings and you're trying to get your parents to let you do something, if only one of you is complaining about it, but if three of you are complaining about it, that's a much more powerful front to try to get something than it is just one individually. All right. So we have these documents that we talked about: the American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and then we read together in class Simon Bolivar's Jamaica letter. So all of these ideas are found in these documents. Again, that could be something that's a source for you in a DBQ. It could be something you reference as an outside piece of evidence in a DBQ. So these revolutions are inspired by these documents that write about Enlightenment ideals. So can someone tell me, I know we already mentioned several of these, but when I say Enlightenment ideals, real quick, 3 different people, give me one example of an Enlightenment ideal. Like what would be something that, oh, that's an Enlightenment concept.
Like basic human rights.
Can you give me a more specific example of that, Ashley?
Like right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Or as they say in Europe, property, because we skip the pursuit of happiness or the property part because the whole slavery bit, and Jefferson didn't want to go there. So yeah, Ashley was selfish. He went in and took all 3. That's fine, Ashley, no worries. So life, liberty, and property, and those are natural rights. They cannot be taken from me by a government. They're given to me by my divine creator, or whatever you may believe in at the time, which is another right of religious freedom and tolerance. I should be able to worship or not worship whom or whatever I want to, and that should not be your business. And we start to see that become socially accepted and politically accepted over the course of the time period. All right. Yeah, so those are the concepts that we see during this time period. Any other questions about that? Pretty basic stuff. All right, let's move on. 5.3, the Industrial Revolution, another major concept of time period 3. Now we know Industrial Revolution doesn't happen everywhere, but where it happens, it changes everything about that society. You know, that's a word I don't like to use, but it truly does, in fact, change everything in those places. Now, someone remind me, and one at a time, unlike Ashley, selfishly. I know, it's okay. I forgive you. I'm used to forgiving you, even though I don't want to, but it's okay. I'm very lenient and patient these days. There are 3 places that are industrialized by 1900. Can somebody tell me one of those places?
Japan.
Japan. Ooh, the underdog first. Nice. Good job. Japan. Only non-Western society industrialized by 1900. Correct. Where else? Somebody.
America.
United States. Yes. Thank you, Isaac. And then one more.
Britain.
What?
Britain.
Think a little bigger, Sebastian. Not just Britain.
Western Europe.
Western Europe. West side. Correct. So we're going to see multiple states in Western Europe industrialized. That's correct. Russia a little bit, but pretty far back from the rest of them. So by 1900, those 3 places are going to be the industrial powers of the world. And we know that if you're an industrialized power by 1900, what does that mean for you, kiddos?
You're
You're gonna-
stronger.
Okay? Much like Mr. Rich, you're going to flex on everybody, okay? You're going to be dominant, powerful. People will run in fear from you when you walk down the hallway. That's right, okay? So, I've been working out a lot recently, so, you know, tank top days are coming back. That's right. Yeah. Who said guys in their 40s can't bring the gun show back? That's right. So, don't be embarrassed. It's the way it is. All right. Father Time, get out of the way. That's what I say. So the point is, of course, none of that's true, but that's fine. The point is that we're going to see those 3 societies basically do whatever they want to anybody else, dominate them economically. And of course, what other effect of this do we see because of the economic and political dominance of these societies? How else are they going to dominate certain parts of the world?
Culturally?
Could be, but I'm thinking more practically, like literal domination.
Imperial.
Imperialism, the creation of major large empires. China and India, the greatest civilizations economically and in many cases culturally for much of human history, are totally just whooped in time period 3. India literally taken over, China pretty as close as you can get to being taken over, and dominated economically, which is something that even 100 years earlier would have been inconceivable. It's like me saying in 2100, America will no longer be a great power. That could happen. I don't know. But when I say that, your natural reaction to that statement is, no way. America, that will be like saying China in 1650 would suck in 1750. That's the same reaction a lot of people would have given you. So, or saying the Roman Empire would have collapsed. Well, it did. So those things do in fact occur. I hope it doesn't happen, but it certainly could. But it'd be rather unlikely when you look at the factors right now, but things change. We never know. All right, so the Industrial Revolution depends on a variety of factors. There's a big bullet point list on page 102. Remember a simple phrase if you take macroeconomics in college, you start with what's called the factors of production. What do you need to open a business? Land, labor, capital. You need natural resources, you need workers, and you need money to get started. Those are the three things you need. So the societies that will create industrial technology are going to have lots and lots of those factors. So what kind of natural resources are most important during the Industrial Revolution?
Coal.
Coal, absolutely, because we're using the steam engine, which runs on coal, and you heat water. I was going to say you heat hot water. That would be dumb. You heat water, which then evaporates, causing steam, which turns a piston and starts an engine to move. Good. And then what are we mostly building stuff out of in the early industrial era?
Steel.
That comes later.
Cotton.
What?
Cotton.
We are creating textiles out of that, but that's not what our factories and our engines are made out of.
Iron.
Correct. Iron. Good old Fe. Very good. So we are using iron. So then the states that have iron and coal are going to have a great advantage. Who has massive amounts of that? Britain, the United States, massive, massive amounts. Now you can import it like Japan, but we know a little bit ahead of ourselves in time period 4, one of the reasons the Japanese are going to become so aggressive militarily is they don't have a lot of those materials, and they're going to have to go to China to get them. And so they start to flex on people that don't have the technology they do to maintain those supplies. And that helps lead to World War II, in fact. But that's outside of our time period for the test, but those are things we discussed. So it's like a desire for these resources definitely influences behavior. Absolutely. All right. So we need workers. So in Britain, for example, we have had what's called an agricultural revolution. We change how we plant crops. We develop some basic machines to help us grow crops faster, to bury the seeds, to cover them up, all those things. And so by the time we get to the early part of time period 3 in Britain, they're making more food than ever before with less humans doing the work, which means they got people that need work. They got people that need jobs. And so many people move to cities. One of the other characteristics of industrialization is urbanization. That's where the jobs are. That's where the markets are. That's where the transportation centers are. And so we're going to put most of our factories either in an urban setting or pretty darn close to one. Okay. Like the Toyota plant in Kentucky, which just reopened, I think it's reopening Friday after being closed for several weeks, is in Georgetown. Georgetown is about 20 minutes from Lexington. So it's close enough to a major urban center that you can get workers, you can get access to supplies, all that kind of stuff. I've told you before, Amazon has 3 distribution plants, warehouses, not plants, within an hour and a half of Louisville. Why? Because they ship UPS, and UPS is based in Louisville. So you got to be close enough to an urban center to get workers, to have transportation, et cetera. And then capital, we need money. So we either need banks that will lend out money, or we need a wealthy class that can afford to help start businesses. Because when I start a new business, I'm not going to make money for a while. It's not like whenever we can start going back to restaurants and theaters and, clubs and stuff like that, it's going to, let's hire all the workers back, let's go. No, it's going to take weeks, months for those businesses to build back up, because that's how that stuff works. You got to pay people, you got to pay rent, you got to, your gas bills due, all those kind of things. And so you need rich people who can put money into businesses and sit there for 5 years and not expect payment. Then when the payment comes, they can afford it. So we need rich people. Well, think about Britain. They have colonies for hundreds of years. That means they've had merchants who have made vast amounts of money who then can afford to invest in new businesses. So you need land, natural resources, labor, enough workers, and capital. money to get this stuff started. So that's what you need. And the societies that do this successfully have lots of those factors. And then as they start to industrialize, they make more and more money, which creates that massive separation between those nations at the bottom of the world that don't have these resources and those that do, going up and up and up and up. And that gap gets further and further and further. It's like if you skip, you don't start school to the 6th grade for some reason. Technically, you're 6 years behind everybody else. But in theory, you're way farther behind than that because you have to just catch up on so many different things. So I always admire kids that come in from other cultures. You have to literally learn English while learning math, while learning to read literature, while learning history. You're doing twice the work. It's really challenging for those kids. So it's always impressive to me, people that can do that. So those are all parts of this process that will eventually change pretty much every aspect of life and the people that are living that. We have what's called the factory system. We know the early factories are pretty awful. None of us would want to work in those places. They were dark, they were scary, they were loud. We had little children employed. We employed women, not because of equality, but because we'd pay them less. There was really no workers' rights in the early factory days. So you got paid what you got paid. If you didn't like it, you got hurt, sorry, your fault. Don't need somebody that's hurt working in my factory. By the end of time period 3, we have evolved by passing laws demanding certain rights, by creating labor unions where people come together and demand certain rights from their workers. And we start to improve those conditions by the end of time period 3. And therefore, we create what's called the middle class. People that are just regular working folks, but who are making enough money and don't work all the time to have a fairly decent lifestyle, to have free time. Our ancestors, unless they were nobles or kings or queens, had no free time. You worked sun up to sundown, you were exhausted, you went to bed. That's pretty much what you did. Now we're going to have people that have money and have a Saturday to do things. So we start seeing the creation of leisure culture, of professional sports, of parks, of beach societies where people, like businesses to sell to people who are going to go to the beach, amusement parks, early versions of that, magazines, because we're also going to public school in most of these cultures, not to the day we are now. By 1900, many societies, you had to go to school till basically 8th grade. I think I've told you this before. None of my 4 grandparents graduated high school, but they all went through at least 8th grade, and then they had to go help their families do whatever they were doing, and that wasn't really seen as a big problem. But that was kind of the expectation. But if you go to 8th grade, you're going to learn how to read. You're going to know basic math. And so that increases the skill level of society. So we're definitely going to see an increase in the capacity for people to develop ideas. So really what creates the middle class is better economic opportunity through industrialization and better education through public schooling. And so it's going to allow more people to rise up and have a say in society and get better jobs eventually and that kind of thing. Both of my parents were the first people in their families to go to college. And so that has given me many opportunities that my grandparents never had and that kind of thing. And for my 3 nieces, it's the expectation they'll go to college. It's just kind of course they will. And one's currently there right now. So the younger 2, it's just kind of course they'll go. That's just kind of what's expected. I don't know if that's a good thing or not that it's just expected, but it's kind of where we've gotten to. So we've seen this progression of opportunity over the last 200 years because of industrialization. Now, industrialization, of course, has some negative effects. Can somebody give me a negative effect of industrialization outside of the fact that early factories are pretty much, awful, awful places to work? Outside of that, how else does this hurt society?
Global warming.
Okay, so environmental damage, absolutely. It's really not until the last couple decades that we started to learn what we've done in terms of our planet. We just didn't really pay attention or didn't know or didn't really care, to be honest, the first 150 years of industrialization for the most part. Obviously, that's good. I mean, that's not good, but that's a good answer. That's true. What happens in these early societies when people don't get paid much? What does that mean in cities where all these factories are located?
They don't have money for sewage and sanitation and things like that. So they're all living on top of each other.
Yeah, so disease is
disease.
rampant. Perfect, excellent, great. Crime is high. For most people, they're not master criminals. Most people that commit crimes is because they're hungry and they're poor and they're desperate to try to feed their families. And so it leads to increasing crime. We create the world's first police forces in time period 3 because we have bigger cities with more people who are more desperate, which means more crime. And so we create modern policing in the 1830s. So you think of most of human history, we never had a police force in ancient Egypt. We never had a police force in the Roman Empire. You just kind of took care of yourself. Well, policing is something we see as more of a need because we have more people living in one place with more crime. And so that does happen. All right. So there's a lot of good, but there's also some bad things. Child labor, exploiting women for their labor, et cetera, et cetera. All those things are part of it. Now, 5.5, page 104 talks about the technology specifically. We know we have new machines like the steam engine at first. By the end of time period 3, we have the internal combustion engine, which a form of that is still used in most cars in the world today. You have technologies like the railroad to massively increase transportation ability, the telegraph, later the telephone for communication. We're able to cross the Atlantic Ocean in about 6 minutes in 1860 to communicate, whereas previously it would have took months. So the massive amount of change that happens. Early railroads are not terribly fast, but they still generally, you can get to a place about 1/4 of the time it would have taken you without a railroad. So you can literally go back and forth twice on what used to be a one-way journey. That massively increases trade, increases economic activity, all those kind of things. We also start using coal, as we mentioned earlier, and oil by the end because of these new engines. And so that's going to increase our use of fossil fuels, our desire for them, and then, of course, our conflict over them as well. Many wars will be fought about that. So all sorts of new technology, some of it good, some of it really helping our species, and some of it doing quite a bit of bad things as well. All right. So government's role in general in capitalism, the idea is that individuals do this, that it is up to you and I to make this happen and not the government. But we know that we see various states heavily involved. Japan happens because of what's called the Meiji Restoration, a revolution supported by the government of Japan. So heavily subsidized, even by time period. When I say subsidized, that means we help pay for. So if something is subsidized and it costs you $100, your parents say, I'll pay $50 if you raise $50 on your own. That would be a subsidy, helping to pay for something. Sorry if I used a word you didn't know there. And the British and the Americans and whatnot start doing it on their own, but by 1900, governments are involved there. As we start to produce food in factories for the first time, it's pretty nasty, pretty gross. A lot of things end up in food you don't want to know about. So we create a government agency in the United States to inspect our food, the Food and Drug Administration, which is still around right now. People that say, like, let's get this vaccine out. Come on. True. That'd be awesome. The problem is we need to know, like, what could happen if we all have this vaccine. Are there negative effects? So we have to test that, which means we have to be patient for a little while longer while it's developed. Now, there could be other drugs that help, like, minimize the symptoms of COVID, but of actual vaccine, we have to test, and we got to wait a couple weeks and see if people like grow a third arm or something. That would be bad. So we got to make sure that we have those testing capabilities. Science takes a while, which sometimes isn't easy for us because we want to have answers right now, but that's what's happening. So anyway, that's part of it. It talks about on page 106.5.7, the development of capitalism, a free market, that instead of the government deciding what we trade, that it should be individuals like you and I, the market. We decide what products we like. We decide what foods we like. We decide what clothes to wear. People market them to us. People try to sell us things, but we make that decision. And if something is crap, then we won't buy it. If it's too expensive or they aren't nice to us, we won't buy it. And that business will go out of business. And that's the way it should be. Of course, we know that we really don't have truly laissez-faire, hands-off capitalism. The government is heavily involved in every state from the beginning. Right now, what our government did the last couple of weeks of sending out checks to people, of loaning money to small businesses who are trying to keep them active until this is over, or at least gets better. None of that would have been something Adam Smith would have approved. Adam Smith would have been, no, whoa, let them fail. Of course, he never lived in a pandemic like this, but he said he would have let stuff fail. It's their fault. That's pretty rough go of it, but that's kind of what he would have said. So it's going to we make more products, the prices go down, and so the middle class, and even the poor to some extent, can afford to have things in their homes. They can have dishes instead of just eating with their hands. They can afford to have a bed to sleep in instead of just sleeping on the floor. And so we start seeing an increase in the standard of living for most people. We also see better nutrition. We also see the introduction of early medical ideas, such as vaccines, such as scientific knowledge of how does disease spread. And so the other characteristic we see in the industrial era is massive population growth. While the average family size gets smaller in industrial areas because women are going to be working, children are not going to be working as much by the end of time period 3, so they're going to school, so they cost more, if you will. So the average family size goes down quite significantly, and this is the demographic transition. You all learned about this last year. It's something we've seen in every industrial society across the planet. As we industrialize, our population growth slows. But overall population goes up because many of us survive that would have died earlier due to malnutrition or a lack of basic medical care. So once we survive infancy and become adults, we are likely to have children and increase the population further. And that definitely happens in time period 4, but we see that process begin in time period 3. It's estimated we hit 1 billion people for the first time somewhere around 1800. And now we're at 7.5+ billion. So you see, obviously, the changes that have happened because of industrialization have overall helped more people survive for a longer time. All right, 5.8, we're almost done. We have 5.8 and 5.9, and then we're finished. 5.8 says reactions to industrial society. How do people respond? Well, there's a lot of people that say we need reform, that this is a bad process. It hurts people. Again, remember to divide industrialization in half. The first half is things are pretty rough. They're really bad for most people. We see progress. Second part of industrial revolution, later 19th century, lives have gotten better, middle class is formed, cleaner ways to live, more laws passed regulating work hours and benefits and treatment of people, trying to build houses for people in society, building sewers to increase our access to clean water, all of those kind of things. But we know we see labor unions that work hard on this. We see governments pass laws, as I mentioned. We see new political parties. Today, the most popular leftist party in Great Britain is called the Labour Party. When they were founded, they were literally trying to help workers, and that's their origin, is a workers-based party helping people get more rights in a factory setting. We also see criticism, guys like Karl Marx, who creates basically socialism and influences communism, who says that we need a global revolution where people will violently rise up and overthrow the people in charge. That doesn't happen, and for most of us, that's a good thing. But his ideas will influence that we should be cognizant, we should be thinking about trying to help poor people, about trying to create a system of more equality. And today we see that in what's called democratic socialism, where in countries we vote to pass laws to increase the minimum wage, to provide basic health care for all citizens, to provide opportunities for everybody to try to improve their lives. And so that's something we see as the evolution, if you will, of Marx's ideas, away from the violence for the most part and towards more helping people through government policy. We will see communism in period 4, but we're not going to talk about that because period 4 is not on our exam. But just to remember, the fundamental difference is in socialism, the people would rise up and create equality of their own through a revolution. In communism, a government would enforce it on you and make you do that through the threat of violence. And we know we see that in the Soviet Union, China, etc., in period 4. Many societies around the planet that we haven't talked about will flirt with industrialization. China, the Ottoman Empire, those societies particularly discuss it. They even have limited periods of reform. But for various reasons, for example, like in China, industrialization is not a Western idea. And we know because of the Middle Kingdom and China's great success as probably the leading society in most of humanity's history, they just refuse to modernize along Western lines. We just don't like it. And we know that's going to cause great troubles in China, things like the Opium Wars, when they are basically become, a nation of drug addicts, at least among leading society, that's forced upon them by Britain. They try to fight back and limit this trade, and the British just dominate them. Because even though Britain is a much smaller nation, a much less populous nation, they have industrial technology and the Chinese lack that. The Ottoman Empire doesn't fall apart, but they're called the sick man of Europe. And they've been around for hundreds of years, and they're slowly getting smaller because they're trying to compete with people that are making things in factories, and they're still making stuff by hand. It's too expensive. They're slower to ship, and so they just lose their customer base. And that tightens their economy, which tightens the size of their empire, and eventually they will be destroyed in time period 4 as well. Just like the Qing Chinese, just like the Russian Revolution, we're going to see a lot of changes in places that don't have industrial technology. They can't keep up, okay? And then lastly, it talks about new, I've already mentioned this, but new societal changes like the middle class being created. At first, the middle class was just a small group. It was your managers in factories. It was your merchants. It was your doctors, your lawyers. By the end of time period 3 in industrial societies, it is expanded to include a lot of workers too. Average people who make good enough money to live in a nicer place, to have some free time, to take vacations, things that would have been impossible 100 years earlier. Okay. We also know that women work, but especially amongst the middle class, there starts to become this notion that women should stay home, that they should be the primary caregivers for children, that is their primary role, and they don't have a choice in the matter. Again, there's nothing wrong with choosing to do that. That's great. But the societal concern is that there is not a choice. It is the expectation. Men are harassed if their wives work, if they have some money, because you're not a good husband, you can't provide for your family, what's wrong with you? Like that kind of thing. So this is called the cult of domesticity, domestic meaning home. So this idea that women belong in the home, that's where they stay, and that will be the predominant cultural idea in industrial societies for well over 150 years. Is that is the primary expectation of women. And I already mentioned some of the last bullet point there, a lot of the challenges of urbanization, more crime, sewage problems, disease spreading, not enough access to opportunities for enough people because there's too many people in too small of an area. So that is Unit 5. It's really about political revolution and the Enlightenment and industrialization, two concepts of which I think you guys are pretty good with. You all did well in your exams on this. We had some good class discussions about these ideas when we were in school together, so I think that's something that you guys understand fairly well. Questions from anybody about the things we just talked about?